Hello, it's Simon here from Analog Anorak, and today I'm talking about For Duke, which was a tribute record recorded in 1978, and this was 4 years after the death of Duke Ellington. One of the reasons why I'm talking about this record is that it's one of these ones that really gets a nice balance between a highly respected audiophile recording system and artist performance, because this record is a great heartfelt jazz session in tribute to Duke Ellington. It was released on M&K Real-Time Records, which I think was based in Beverly Hills in California. And it did seem to be that the West Coast was an area where there were quite a few collections of different jazz musicians, quite a few ex-Ellington sidemen around who used to play in different incarnations, from full big bands to small units. But also it did seem to be around this time that there was a bit of a renaissance in the direct-to-disc recording system. The renaissance of direct-to-disc was quite a purist approach to recording. I've got a tiny direct-to-disc collection. Behind me it's these, the two at the top and one to the side. The Laurindo Almodar is another one that was done on the West Coast in the 70s. The other two are quite recent, involving the Sid Lawrence Band with a selection of big band classics. They are all really good, but as far as sound quality, there is something very special about For Duke. If we look at the direct-to-disc technology, first of all, before we go into the particulars about For Duke, it is a system that is a kind of renaissance of the original way that records were made in the 20s to the 40s, when there weren't any options such as magnetic tape to store and edit. Many of my direct-to-disc recordings are like this one of Duke Ellington's, the original 78s, which, due to the arrangements at the time, were done in one room, initially with just one microphone. At later points other microphones were introduced, and in the other room, simultaneously to the music being made, the disc was being cut by the engineers. And these records do have a lovely alive quality when you play them on a good system, but it is a much more primitive technology, and of course there is the surface noise, which for some people is the deal breaker. So if we go on to what happened in the late 60s and 70s, they revisited this form, and of course by this point there was a huge advance in the quality of the microphones available, and also cutting lathes had really come on significantly. So there was this ability to meld this very simple system with much higher quality equipment, but there was also a difference which put the artists under a lot more pressure, because there was this obvious shift from the 5-6 minute long 78 records, where if a big mistake happened, it wasn't a complete disaster to start again, to doing whole sides of LPs in one go. And due to this high sense of jeopardy, you do find that it is only highly experienced live recorders who generally can pull this off, of being able to just relax enough to be accomplished enough to rarely make mistakes, and also to produce something special on that occasion. The particular recording technology done for Duke did have a few tweaks, especially with the microphones, that I think it was Ken Kreisel who, alongside Jonas Miller, were responsible for this company. But Kreisel did take his Neumann microphones and AKG microphones and tweak them to get them to sound exactly how he wanted them, to get the most out of them. And that is very reminiscent of the Decca engineers that I'm a bit obsessed with, who would also tweak their microphones to just squeeze out that extra bit of performance. They did do other direct-to-disc recordings, but it's only really for Duke that does have this legendary status. I think Salvatore included it in the Divinity, and it is, and this record has stayed in the Absolute Sound list for a very long time indeed. So what else is going on? So one of the strengths about this record is that it's eight compositions by Duke Ellington. And Duke Ellington was an extremely accomplished composer who produced a wealth of material. He had this really long recording career, starting off in 1923 with the formation of the Washingtonians, and later it became the Duke Ellington Orchestra. And he continued to compose until he died in 1974. So what we've got here is the absolute luxury of a huge number of great tunes to choose from. And they've gone for basically all killer, no filler. And there are some great standards like Mood Indigo, Take the A Train, Perdido, Cottontail. And we also need to look at the band. The band involved is Bill Berry and the All-Stars. I think it would be fair to say that for Duke, for people who are just really obsessed about the Duke Ellington band, it's not really high on their radar, because what they're really interested in are the performances by the legendary musicians who came into their own in the 20s, then in the Renaissance during the Second World War, and later on the final big Renaissance during the Columbia years in the 50s. The musicians involved with Bill Berry's All-Stars are, however, accomplished jazz musicians, consisting of some people who had played with Ellington and others who were deeply influenced by Duke Ellington recordings. I want to go into a bit of detail about some of the members of the band, the ones with the more illustrious biographies. And I think if I start off with Britt Woodman, who plays trombone on for Duke and does some wonderful solos during the session. Britt Woodman joined the Duke Ellington Orchestra in 1951, and this was a period of significant change in personnel. He went on to stay for nearly 10 years, and there was great consistency during this period in the trombone section, and he, alongside John Sanders and Quentin Jackson, got extremely tight with their section work and were a solid part during this period. In many of the records and live performances he's present on, he doesn't do much solo work despite being quite accomplished. And this was because he was competed against some of the most famous, accomplished soloists going. I think one of the records, this one behind me, the Duke Ellington record, Such Sweet Thunder, is one where he's showcased a little bit more. This record was inspired by Shakespeare, his plays and his sonnets. Duke Ellington picked up on the fact that Shakespeare tended to write parts for particular actors that he'd worked with, and he followed a similar approach with this album, writing compositions with one particular musician or groups of musicians in mind. And there's a composition called Sonnet for Hank Sank, which is Duke's version of Henry V. And during this recording, Britt Woodman really gets to stand in the spotlight, and it's a very accomplished performance. There's also another composition called The Telecasters, which was written for the trombone section of of three musicians inspired by the three weird sisters from Macbeth. Another great listen. There is another really reliable old hand available, Marshall Royal. He's on alto sax, and he did play sometimes with the Duke Ellington band in the 30s. During that period, he came into contact with Duke Ellington's master of the alto sax, Johnny Hodges, and this contact had a big impact on Marshall Royal's style of playing, and he developed it further to bring in some of the qualities Johnny Hodges had into his section playing as well. He was approached to join the Duke Ellington band in about 1951 after Johnny Hodges left to go solo for a period because of these similarities, but it was a case of really poor timing in that he had just agreed to join the Count Basie Orchestra, which had recently reformed back into a big band, and he stayed playing with Count Basie for 20 years. There was a quite famous interaction between the Duke Ellington Orchestra and the Count Basie Orchestra, and it was this Columbia recording, which is very loud and very lively. At the time that this came out, it was kind of publicised as a battle of the bands, that inspired by the sort of competitive performances that would occur at the Savoy between various big bands trying to get one up on each other. But by this period, there was so much mutual respect and love between the musicians, and particularly between Ellington and Basie, that what they really wanted this record to be was a kind of celebration of each other's styles and working together. During the recording, which involved Marshall Royal playing for the Count, it sounds like there are anecdotes that there was quite a lot of liquid refreshment consumed between takes, and it was quite a lively affair with stories about a fight taking place involving a knife, but it wasn't between rival band members on different sides. It was actually two Duke Ellington band members who didn't get on at all well. So with Marshall Royal, we've got a really accomplished, experienced musician who, due to his style, is in a perfect position to take on some of the parts that would have originally been played by Johnny Hodges. It's also helpful that there was a double bass player called Ray Brown available. Ray Brown's CV is extensive. It really sounds like he played with just about everyone going, from Charlie Parker to Elvis Costello during a very varied career. Just looking back at some of the records I've got there, he played with Lorenzo Almodóvar. The record that's the tribute to Ella Fitzgerald, he played with Ella Fitzgerald, even married her for a few years. Other musicians include Dizzy Gillespie, Oscar Peterson. But going back to when Ray Brown was a fledgling musician, he was deeply inspired by Jimmy Blanton, the 1940s bass player for Duke Ellington, who introduced a much more harmonic component to double bass rather than just pure rhythm. And he has talked how when he was young he would play those 78s featuring Jimmy Blanton so frequently, playing alongside, that he said the grooves would sometimes just turn white in the end. Another thing that would have been a dream for Ray Brown was in the 70s, there were two recording sessions with Duke Ellington for Pablo Records, which are highly respected, and one was inspired by Blanton. It's called This One's for Blanton, but the other one as well I'll go back to at the end of this video. It's called Duke's Big Four. There are three other musicians, Nat Pierce, Scott Hamilton, Frankie Capp. Probably the most notable was Nat Pierce on piano, because he in the latter part of Duke Ellington's career would sometimes stand in for him on piano. The last person I want to focus in on is the group's leader, Bill Berry. He joined the Duke Ellington Orchestra in 1961 and played with them for a couple of years. He was originally a trumpet player, but he does play cornet on for Duke. And he wrote about how Duke Ellington introduced new musicians and how he wanted them to tackle taking over parts that were sometimes intricately linked with a particular musician's style. And his approach was he encouraged the musicians to have the artistic freedom and introduce their own personality rather than trying to replicate these performances. In the notes on For Duke, he does talk about how he kind of used this philosophy in the approach to the performance of this tribute record, that he wasn't looking for a reverential recreation. He was more seeing this, this degree of freedom and expression as being the correct way to pay tribute to Duke. I can kind of understand that. I've got a record by the Alan Cohen Band that has, in tribute to Duke Ellington, recreated in reverential detail the composition Black, Brown and Beige, which was only available in edited forms with the Duke Ellington Orchestra. And although it is a really interesting, accomplished recording, I do sort of see that perhaps that degree of reverence and academic study on that record does mean that it's a little bit stilted compared with what's going on with For Duke, which is a much more head arrangement of jazz and much freer in approach. One of the other things about For Duke that might be slightly adding to this audiophile status is the fact that they did use a small unit rather than a full big band. I have collected, in addition to the more famous Duke Ellington Orchestra albums, some made by smaller groups of musicians. I do find that the recordings by the smaller groups do appeal to my audiophile sensibilities. I do think that the smaller groups can sometimes be a little bit too relaxed, particularly if Duke Ellington isn't present, and they rarely reach the artistic heights of the full orchestra. Going back to the direct-to-disc technology, I do wonder whether the pressure associated with the whole direct-to-disc approach did just spur on the musicians to greater heights, because sometimes pressure then leads to adrenaline, and yes, there's always that risk that something terrible could happen, but there's also that potential for magic to happen. Hello, you want to come on up? So I do think that a good example of a scenario where pressure does lead to magic, I think, is the Beatles session, which ended with Twist and Shout, where they knew that John Lennon had only one take left in his voice, but somehow this extra pressure did just lead to an unforgettable performance. There are some very positive reviews of For Duke, praising the transparency, the artistic expression, and I think it's all really justified. I think it deserves the hype. It's just a shame that because of the way that this was all just put onto one master disc, it has significantly reduced the number of copies available. Here is my treasured copy of For Duke, and it was one of the last albums I bought during a 3-year period of really focusing in on Duke Ellington. And because I was regularly looking at auctions and stuff, I did get a copy that was very well priced at £20. This was a few years back. Now that's on the lower end, normally what you'd associate with a pretty battered vinyl record, but it was actually near mint, and I really treasure this record. It does have a lovely quality when you put this on. It is just that sense of realism that I don't think I've got another record like it, in that a lot of records are lovely to listen to, and you do feel almost like the band is in the room with you. But with this one, it's even more real. It has this, for me, this wonderful quality that I'm almost there sitting in with the band. And it's that special quality rather than its reputation that means that I find it really hard to part with this one. It is available on CD now, but obviously that makes a more complex link rather than this direct path from performance to groove, which I think is really the USP about this. But it's expensive and tricky, and it's getting trickier to get hold of a decent copy. And I do think that there is a very similar record that is more affordable and less tricky to get hold of a copy, and that's Duke's Big Four. So here's one of my 2 copies of this, and it's a lovely copy, and it's got Ray Brown again. As I mentioned, it's also got Louis Bellson and Joe Pass on jazz guitar, and of course Duke Ellington as well. And this was recorded in '73, and it was pretty close to when Duke Ellington died, and in some respects some of his creative powers were reducing, but not his performance on the piano. And this is just a stunning performance. It's got similar qualities. It's a small band. It's picking some classic Ellington tunes, and it just puts a big smile on your face. It's very well recorded, engineered by Val Valentin, who did a lot of great jazz recordings for Verve. He also did, I think, the Velvet Underground 3rd album, which is a triumph. So I would strongly recommend this as a record. Yes, it's not got that legendary status, but this is lovely and still very affordable. I hope I've managed to do a bit of a deep dive into For Duke to help clarify why this record is top of the list. But I think to finish off, there is a lovely bit of writing by Bill Berry on the album notes that I just think sums things up really nicely. So I'll just read that for you. So Bill Berry said, "We did For Duke without trying to recreate anything, because you can't, not even what happened last night, let alone 20 years ago. Yet I think we very much captured what Ellington meant. It's swinging, happy, and feels good. And it's pretty in parts, covers a lot of emotions, the way he would have liked it." And that's For Duke, a great record and a great tribute. I'm hoping to do some more videos on Duke Ellington in the future. I am very much aware that the people most likely to come across this video are going to be more engaged, more interested in the latter recordings, such as the Columbia albums. But I do hope to go back to some of the earlier recordings, such as the 40s, 78s. And I hope you've enjoyed this, and I hope to get another video together sometime. Thanks. Bye. Joy's not been particularly sociable today, but I think it's just the hot weather. She's been enjoying it too much. But Yeah, I'll try to shove in a few clips.
She always wants to win. In 12 years of doing these races, she's never lost. In the winter, I almost never cut these off. So they're nice and sharp and she can get a good grip on the snow. I think she likes the grip she gets. She'll dive into the snow and jump around, climbing on big boulders and exploring. She always looks super happy outside.
Dory?
When she was 7 years old, we decided to permanently move to the country house.